If we don't tell people what the different factions are, the different tribes in the history, it's going to keep happening. Even as we go to new methodologies, the same people are going to come up and they're going to cherry pick, they're going to find holes because none of this stuff is perfect.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Base Carbon. It's time to get serious on carbon. Learn more at basecarbon.com.
Welcome back to Carbon Frontiers 2024 on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abex Technologies. Our guest today is Steve Zwick, host and producer of Bionic Planet, which focuses on navigating the new reality of life on a managed planet. We'll be putting some of today's controversies in the voluntary carbon markets into their historical context, while also discussing what's gone wrong and what's gone right with the first generation of RED projects and with the media criticism they've come under. Hello, Steve. Welcome to Smarter Markets.
Hey, Dave, how's it going?
It's going well, and better for you being here. You know, I've learned a lot from our conversations over the past few years, and I'm glad to be able to share this conversation with our listeners here on Smarter Markets. In your own podcast, Bionic Planet, you're producing a new series telling the untold story of the voluntary carbon markets, and in particular, the science and development of the Verified Carbon Standard, or the VCS, and that first generation of projects reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries, the RED Plus projects, both of which have come under such intense media criticism over the past year. And maybe that's a good place for us to start. I'm curious, why are you calling this series The Tribes of the Climate Realm? And why spend so much time on these projects that seem sometimes like they're from the past when we're moving on to a new methodology in RED Plus?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And the main reason is there's this huge disconnect between the technical debates that are happening in the community and the public discourse. And this has been going on for about 20 years, as long as I've been here. And I think it comes from the fact that we have different ideological factions in the space. This is not a monolithic entity. And so, it's a very tribal community, the climate world. And it was also a world that existed kind of on its own for a long, long time. People who've been in it for a while know who's who, but people who are just coming in don't know. And I think a lot of the kind of competing tribes, for lack of a better way of putting it, some of them are just better at communicating than others. And a lot of the tribes that are better at communicating are more ideological than, say, scientific. And I think this is a huge problem when people are trying to understand these markets. So in trying to communicate what's really happening, I think it's important to do a couple of things. One is go back to see where these markets came from and why they are the way they are. And the other is, what are the different ideological factions? And I also want to make it clear that I'm not saying that my tribe is the right one and others are wrong. I think there are within this whole realm, you have legitimate philosophical debates that are never going to be resolved and should be allowed to compete openly. And then you have some people who are just not really playing fair. They're not really trying to educate people. They're cherry picking. They're distorting, very much like the merchants of doubt in Naomi Oreskes' book, The People Who Tried to Undermine Confidence in Climate Science Itself. And I feel like the best way to counter that, because if we don't tell people what the different factions are, the different tribes in the history, it's going to keep happening. Even as we go to new methodologies, the same people are going to come up and they're going to cherry pick, they're going to find holes because none of this stuff is perfect.
And that's one of the things I'm really enjoying with the approach you're taking, because oftentimes over the past year or two, the voluntary carbon markets all do seem to resemble a bit of a circular firing squad when we all really need to figure out a way to make progress moving forward despite differences in views and perspectives. And I like the way that in your current approach, you're trying to put many of the current controversies in the context of where these standards and methodologies came from, the compromises that were made, the conversations and controversies that led us to where we are today and how they developed. And maybe you could walk us through a little bit of that. Why and in response to what did the VCS and the first generation of Red Plus projects develop?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick, even though there's a lot to it. So I think there's really two phases to the creation of the voluntary carbon markets. If you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, it was really just about experimentation and trying to find ways to draw companies in. There were efforts to get companies to sort of pay attention to climate change, to get them to take early action. You had some corporate leaders who really wanted to make a difference, and then you had NGOs who were trying to lure all companies into it. You also had talk of regulation. Remember, the IPCC was formed in 1988, and people assumed we'd have regulation. And companies were sensing that we're going to have to deal with this risk one day. Let's dip our feet in the water. I mean, and specifically on RED, it started in 1988. There was a agroforestry project called Miquentia, and WRI got involved, and they were looking at this. And AES, an energy company, was like, hey, it was looking to see, hey, how can we reduce our footprint? We can't, renewable energy is just not cost effective at this point. Maybe we can plant trees somewhere else, somewhere in Hawaii, I think they were looking at. Then WRI said, well, why don't you go into the developing world? There you can have some social good. Go into this area and plant trees in this agroforestry project that's struggling to make money. They went in and they looked at it, and then in doing the analysis, a guy named Mark Trexler, who's going to be on the show, kind of a critic these days, but he actually had the original insight and said, hey, wow, look at this. You could actually, by helping these farmers manage their land more effectively, you're reducing their incentive to go into the forest. And your agroforestry project is actually having a much bigger impact than you realize. So maybe we can look into this. And that became the genesis. And that was like the first insight. And then you had other people, kind of Paul Faith did a paper where he looked at that example and encouraged others to take action. And you had this proliferation. You had dozens of projects, NGOs going in and trying to do the same thing and trying to do it in a way where they could quantify the actual impacts. And this was, I'm going to get into this in more detail in the series, but you had the emergence of the science of land change modeling, which was enabled by satellite images and demographic understandings. And this enabled NGOs to experiment with estimating deforestation risk from various causes all over the world. So you had this proliferation of projects all around the world. And then when the Kyoto Protocol was agreed to, there was a sense that maybe that these types of projects will end up in the clean development mechanism. So then the UNFCCC asked the IPCC to take a look and evaluate these projects, and they came out with a paper that I'll be pointing to again in the series, where they basically looked at all the projects that existed, and they said, there's all these different methods. There's modeling, there's simple logic, there's scenario. They all work in the right circumstances, but there's no way to standardize this. We can't see how it can be standardized. It's always going to be subjective, was essentially what they said. But they also identified models that had emerged that were pretty effective. 1 year later, you had the Kyoto Protocol in Marrakesh. Forestry was tossed out. Avoided deforestation, conservation was thrown out of the accords, which was a disaster, because deforestation was responsible for about, the numbers were all over the place back then, but saying anywhere from, say, 10 to 20%, maybe 15% of global emissions. I think it's about 12% now. So eliminating that was a big blow. And around in 2005, you had this sense that the Kyoto Protocol was coming in. It was going to cover certain things with the clean development mechanism, but there was going to be gaps in it. How can we create incentives for voluntary action, for companies to go beyond what the law requires, beyond what the CDM does, and is as rigorous as possible? And they basically came up with, it was Mark Kenber was the guy who sent out a memo. He now heads the BCMI. And he basically said, hey, went to a bunch of, is there a need for this? Is there a need for a voluntary mechanism? And what should it do? And people came back with, you should do two things. Try to be as rigorous as you can, but also try to test and pilot new methodologies. And I think the important thing was, what was in the spirit of this at the time was this voluntary thing. Anything that worked, what they figured would eventually be folded into compliance mechanisms, and everything else would just be kind of an experiment, and an experiment that you can never really say an experiment fails. If it shows you what works and what doesn't, it's done what it's supposed to do. So the whole thing was fill in the gaps, get people to go beyond what's required, and test new methodologies. And what had happened at that point was that in the intervening 6 years, you had a group of scientists convened under Winrock decided to look at all these models that existed and say which ones work, which ones don't, how well do they work? And they came up with the same thing. All models work, like George Bell. No models work, but some are useful. But they all kind of work in some circumstances. How do you align the model with the circumstances? They outlined this systemic approach that would enable for subjective analysis through a process of expert review, public consultation, get as many eyes on it as possible, and then come up with a baseline, put this out there, and everything else we've got going that's too much detail to go into now, and then test them, evaluate everything every 10 years and see how it goes. So that was really the genesis.
I think what I really appreciate in your approach, Steve, is so often in these markets, there's very much the emphasis that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And, what I come back to in many of the things you talk about is the idea that all of these methodologies work in some circumstances, which also means that not all of them work in every circumstance, and probably most don't work in every circumstance, and we need to understand that. And that it's really about the experimentation, the going beyond what would otherwise be done. And I was curious, when you look back at, that first generation of Red Plus projects, what do you think they accomplished that otherwise wouldn't have happened?
They accomplished a lot. And this goes to what you just said. They introduced a lot more rigor than we had before. People don't realize how, when back in the days of pure philanthropy, there was no accounting. And companies were still making claims, but you would have, one project, a well-meaning project, but it was getting paid by 5 different companies, and nobody knew where results went and who was getting paid more than they needed and stuff like that, or what they really accomplished. So a tremendous amount of rigor now exists in these projects, much, much more than ever came before. When I say, and I also think this idea, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, is one of those things that should be, because we should be trying to get better and better all the time. We just can't expect absolute perfection, and we can't ignore uncertainties. We have to accept uncertainties as we go forward. Another thing, in addition to the real rigor and real reductions, I think we should emphasize this too. Above and beyond the experimentation, there are clear reductions in deforestation in the projects that I know well, but there's debate over how much that reduction was. That is, quantifying that emission reduction is always going to be a little bit iffy, but there is no denying that they achieved clear results. Another thing is in addition to the rigor, they've led to the development of new methodologies, new understanding of the predictive value of different drivers. One evolution in the methodologies, going back to the earlier ones, was they tried to look at as many factors as possible that could drive deforestation in an area. And that led to the creation of methodologies that were overly complex. And that made them not easy to game, but gameable, and maybe easy to game, but also difficult to really verify. So that was a big problem. It wasn't, there's an answer to it, which is they put in independent verification and validation bodies, but it was still a difficult task. Now what they found is some indicators are just much more reliable than others. And focusing just on what's more reliable as a future indicator makes for a more scalable approach that will have fewer false positives, fewer times where there is an estimate that deforestation is going to happen, but it might not happen. And that led to the new methodology that we have. And it's also informed policy because of the improvements in land change modeling that wouldn't have happened without these projects. The policy is able to be improved. So there's so many benefits that have come from this first generation. And again, I think they can be in 2 categories. And one is the actual impacts, which I think are clear despite what a lot of people want to say. And the other is the new methodologies and improvements that have come from that.
Yeah, and I want to come back to this point on the estimate of the baselines, the hypothetical, because much of the criticism of the Red Plus projects in the media has focused on the baselines used for the projects. And that, as you said, the baseline is the estimate of how much carbon dioxide hypothetically would have been emitted from deforestation and degradation on the project site in the absence of the Red Plus project. And as a hypothetical, it's going to be difficult and always subject to varying opinions. But when you've looked at the media criticism and the academic research that's often cited in it, What do you think they get wrong in how they think about these baselines or in how they estimate these baselines?
The big thing that there's so many things that I think they get wrong, but I don't want to discourage people from looking into these things because that's the only way it's going to get better. But I think one big glaring issue that I have now is what you have are two things. You have reporters coming into a project who don't really understand the methodology, and they're kind of being fed by people who don't like markets. And we just have to acknowledge that's a fact. And they're giving them little nitpicky, cherry picky things that they can go after that might be factually accurate but are irrelevant and that detract from the overall impact that the projects are having. And the other is almost the exact opposite, is you're seeing these big meta studies that are coming out that are being taken as gospel. I mean, that West et al. And Continue et al. Were two of the big ones that came out. And if you look at, the way The Guardian and others presented those papers is that 96% of projects are worthless. That's just not true. All those papers showed is that if you take, that there's a low correlation between models developed in social sciences and the deforestation baselines. And the question is, what does that lack of correlation mean? And it gets pretty technical there because they used, the West was using synthetic controls, which are a way of evaluating social impacts. He even said in his paper that he used different covariates, different drivers of deforestation than what was used in the actual project baselines. These were kind of academic exercises. I wouldn't even call them studies. And they were presented as being somehow superior to all this work that had been done by hundreds of scientists over previous decades. And that's just not true. You're taking something that is very uncertain, you're saying that it's more certain than something that is less uncertain. That's just counterproductive. And it detracts from the fact that we are in this period where we're supposed to be evaluating what happened and looking at these things objectively and trying to decide what works and what doesn't. And I think what's happening is, and most reporters, by the way, do get that. I did work, briefly at Vera, and I was kind of talking to reporters, and most of them were coming in with a lot of questions, and and they kind of walked away going, "Yeah, boy, this is really confusing." And then you had a few who would come in with like guns blazing, and they weren't trying to say, okay, we're at this point where we're going to evaluate these projects and see what works and what doesn't. They were like, we're going to shoot this stuff down. And they would come in with things that didn't quite add up. And when you point that out to them, they would go ahead and run what they were going to run anyway. And that is, again, that's a very small percent of the reporters in this space, but they exist. And I think I'm going to have a few of them on my show, by the way. I've continued to talk to these guys, and they vehemently disagree with me on this, and they will have their say. But that's how I see it.
Absolutely. It's terrific, too, to keep the conversation going despite the vehement disagreement. Maybe we'll get somewhere. And I wanted to ask you a bit, because you've looked at a lot of these projects and the various baselines. And is there anything you've learned that people need to keep in mind when you're judging these things with the benefit of hindsight, right? The baselines are laid down, kind of best prediction based on the methodologies of what's going to happen in the future in some hypothetical future. And then often there's kind of a look back over time. When you look back and see like, oh, how did the project do relative to the baseline? Was the baseline too high or too low? Are there certain things that happen that people need to keep in mind for how they reevaluate with the benefit of hindsight, whether a baseline may have been over optimistic or over pessimistic?
Yeah, I think you have to look at changing circumstances. The baselines are designed to update over time anyway. They're not designed to be static over 30 years. And understand that circumstances change and that science changes. I mean, right now we have better data than we ever did before. We also have jurisdictional data, which is a huge change and is what's enabling the new methodology. Sometimes baselines change because of circumstances changing. And sometimes those circumstances change because of the project. And there's one that I would bring up here that is, it's called the Cordillera Azul, which is in Peru. And it's a project that was pretty interesting. It got kind of slammed in the press, mostly because an activist presented his take, and I'd say it contradicts reality. The thing about the project is you had an area of high ecological value, and a group of NGOs got together, lobbied for it to be turned into a park. Government agreed. They said, okay, we'll make it a park if you pay for it. And then they struggled to pay for it. They then went and they were able to use Red Plus to keep the park going. So that's the basic story. But what's interesting is when they created the baseline, one of the things they looked at was in-migration into the area. The in-migration had been massive because there was anticipation that this was going to be a place where people could move in, they could chop trees, they could farm. And after the project, the in-migration dropped dramatically. So the basic critique was that, well, gee, the reduction in in-migration shows that the project overstated its baseline. But you could also argue that the reduction in in-migration was a result of this land being taken off the block, that the fact that they weren't going to be able to deforest in this area. It's the kind of thing that should be evaluated. I think it needs to be evaluated in more detail. You can't tell by looking at the numbers, did the in-migration end on its own through some other circumstance, or was it because people realized, oh, I guess there isn't going to be this big bonanza there, let's not move there? I think it's probably the latter, but we just don't know. But that's an example of a situation where the baseline would be changed dramatically because the project had an impact and the threat is no longer there.
And, as we've been saying, much of the discussion around these projects has been about potential weaknesses in the methodologies and the baselines in particular. But, from our conversations, I found that you have a different point of view on this topic. That is, correct me if I'm ascribing the wrong beliefs to you, but you believe that the weakness isn't really in the methodologies, but the weakness historically has been more in the validation and verification bodies, or VVBs, that audit the projects. Can you explain the role of the VVBs and why you believe that historically that's where the weaknesses have been more present?
Yeah, and this is something that I think it has been alluded to. Basically, verification and validation bodies are independent auditors accredited under, initially they were accredited under the UNFCCC, but they could be accredited by national governments, and they're authorized to go in and validate and then verify a project. And this is kind of when I went back to the creation of the methodologies and how do you get this subjective stuff, the subjective overlay in on top of a model, deciding which models to use. And what you do is you have a project proponent who will come up with a plan. He presents it, and then first it has to go to a VVB, a verification validation body, and they will then look at the plan, look at the reality on the ground, and say, is it valid? And that's the validation phase. And then they validate it, then it goes out for public consultation. People are supposed to comment on it and say, hey, wait a minute, this one doesn't quite work because this point is wrong, this point's wrong. So that's phase one. Phase two is verification, where they implement the project and then another VVB comes in and goes and looks and says, are they doing everything they said they would do? And so you have these two phases, one where the baseline is determined and the activities are agreed. If you say, here's the baseline, here's why, you've got, the reason is you've got people chopping trees to make charcoal, so we're going to go in and we're going to give them alternative livelihoods, beekeeping and stuff, or, you come up with a plan. And then the second one is, are they sticking to the plan? And then the payments are made basically saying that if you're sticking to the plan, you're getting the reductions, and then over time they will then come in and they'll look to see what's happening in surrounding areas, reevaluate the baseline. And I think the problem is, as I alluded to before, a lot of these methodologies, like it's the knock on VM9, is it was very complicated. It was just so complicated that in theory, if the VVB was really, really good and knew everything about what's happening on the ground, it'd be almost a perfect methodology, but they just don't. Especially in the first generation, you had Chinese VVBs trying to evaluate projects in Brazil, and they were just too far removed. And I think that is where a lot of issues crept in. And Vera, they seem, this is kind of where it gets iffy. They seem to have recognized that or suspected it, but it wasn't something there was no smoking gun because the first generation of projects hadn't been reevaluated yet. But around 2019 or so, when money started coming in, again, people have to realize there was no money until then, until the market really took off. As money started coming in and Vera started getting funding, they didn't put the funding into communications and stuff. They put it into trying to hire people to do secondary audits on the VVB. So to audit the auditors. And they did find that there were just sloppy, some were sloppier than others. That was one reason for the big slowdown is, because initially they were doing completeness audits, then they went to doing really double checking every step and sending back a lot of questions. So they did find that some VVBs were sloppier than others, and some really needed to be, they had to send these things back 3 or 4 times. And eventually they said, if it comes back to us a third time, it's, you got to start over.
Yeah, I find the VVB discussion so fascinating because, one is the work, as you said, might have been sloppy because there wasn't really much money in the space. And so people were trying their best and just didn't have the resources. And then, as you said earlier in the conversation, sometimes systems get gamed. Any system of people, you're going to have people trying to find folks that'll give them a pass, even if they might not have deserved one. And your discussion of the VVBs reminds me of a lot of the problems with credit rating agencies, which were a big contributor to the subprime mortgage crisis in 2007, 2008 that led to the financial crisis and Great Recession in 08, 09. And so I think, our listeners might be more familiar with that. But to me, it strikes me as like a very analogous situation where if you can find an auditor that'll give you a pass, you'll tend to take one. And hopefully the markets are able to ferret out who are the high quality verifiers and auditors versus those that aren't. And I'm curious, have the issues with the VVBs largely been addressed? Or are there lessons we can learn from the case of the credit rating agencies that might help us improve the weaknesses, if they still exist, with the VVBs?
I think they've largely been addressed in red. Because in red, one of the big changes they made, or they're making under the new methodology, is that VERA defines the baselines, essentially. So that is all taken away from a lot of these subjective groups. There's been accusations that the VVBs provide preferential treatment to groups that pay them. And I don't know. It's in theory that could happen. I think it was more an issue of lack of understanding and lack of quality. And VERA has put a lot of effort into training the VVBs and getting them up to speed. And one other thing I wanted to point out here too, if you don't mind me digressing just a bit, is how much this was born of necessity. Because I have seen this issue covered, and it's usually presented as some kind of a extremely nefarious way of creating an old boys network. And that's not really true. When this was coming together, there were 2 things. There was a lot of talk about this. One was, how are the methodologies created? And the methodologies themselves were usually created by project proponents who would create a methodology, and then it would go through this expert review, public consultation, VVBs and everything. And there's always people saying, well, gee, if you're having the project proponents creating the methodology that they're using, is that a conflict of interest? But there was no other way. This was in 2010 or so, Angela Merkel, she said something about how German government would like to provide some funding to help this voluntary carbon thing move along. Where should it go? And I remember at Ecosystem Marketplace, we called around just asking people, where should it go? And everybody said, put it into independently developed methodologies, because that's what we really need. And nobody wanted to pay for it. And the same thing was happening with the VVBs. Nobody wanted to pay for it. So there's always this thing like when nobody wants to step up and do something, and the one group who does it seems to have a conflict of interest. Is that something you have no choice but to do? And in this case, there was this additional system of public consultation where everything goes out for public consultation. And again, there just weren't enough eyes on it. This was designed on the premise that people would be paying attention and people would look at this stuff and they would see things and call attention to it. And it just didn't happen. You did have public consultation, you did have critiques, but there just wasn't enough of that.
And as we're moving forward, introducing new methodologies, as you've referred to, I'm curious, from your perspective, do you think we might be taking some of the wrong lessons forward into the development of the new methodologies? And do we risk creating new problems because of that? Because we always want to be improving, but do you think we might be taking some of the wrong lessons? Or, what are the lessons you think we should be taking forward?
Yeah, I think it's more that we're sending the wrong signal sometimes. I think we have to keep developing new methodologies, but we can't assume the old ones are bad. There seems to be this sense right now that, okay, out with the old, in with the new. The old methodologies were no good, and the new one's going to be perfect. And that's not true. I think the old methodologies were much better than people give them credit for. And they were developed under really rigorous processes of review and consultation. And the same thing is going into the new methodologies. And the new methodology are also not going to be perfect. You're going to have changes and things are going to happen that we can't anticipate. Just as the advent of jurisdictional data made the new methodologies possible, advances in remote sensing and the ability to really evaluate changes on the ground, these are all changing. And the new methodology, there's going to be issues in the new methodology. And I think we need to be aware of the fact that as these are implemented, people who want to improve the methodologies are going to be pointing that out to make things better, but people who are ideologically opposed are going to be finding those flaws, picking them out of context and blowing them up to undermine confidence. And that's something we need to improve on. The current methodologies, one issue with them is you're based on looking at deforestation that's already occurred in an area and then looking for new deforestation in an analogous area. But these projects usually end up a little bit away from where deforestation has already occurred. It's not really imminent. It's modeled to happen slowly in the future. And because developers don't like to go necessarily into where everything is really happening and crazy and is imminent. The new methodology really drives money to the frontier, which is really, really good. But it leaves a lot of this mosaic stuff out. There's a lot of, in theory, the new methodology will have fewer false positives. In other words, it will send fewer signals about where deforestation is going to happen. It's very accurate the next 3 to 4 years, but it might miss a lot that's happening away. And I think that is something we have to be aware of.
Yeah, and I know, you followed many of the REDD+ projects that have come under scrutiny in the past couple of years. And I would recommend folks listen to your podcast for your in-depth coverage of many of these projects. But I was hoping you might take us on a brief tour of some of these projects you've dug into. Like in terms of what was the criticism and what was the context, and was the criticism deserved or the project misunderstood?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many I could go to. I think the one I'd want to stick with would be the Cordillera Azul that I mentioned earlier, because I just was looking at some emails on that one, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. And this one, if I could criticize the critique maybe a little bit, and in so doing, talk about what the project achieved. So that this project, as I mentioned, was, I told you where it came from. Basically, like when the reporting on this started, the reporter came in with like 20 or 30 quote unquote findings that most of them turned out to not really be legitimate even before looking at the facts. I mean, there was things like, one was he'd heard from a so-called expert that the project was illegitimate because the deforestation rate in the reference area was higher than in the project area. Well, that's how it always is. You're trying to take action in an area where deforestation hasn't occurred, and you're basing that future on deforestation in an analogous area where it has already occurred. And then he was also pointing out that deforestation increased inside the project area after the project began, which is, again, this is reducing deforestation, not eliminating it. Usually, if you're going into a situation that is under imminent threat, you are going to see increases in deforestation. And the idea is the deforestation going to be below what it would have otherwise been? And then he was also claiming alternatively that there could never be deforestation in the project area because it was really hilly terrain. And the irony in this case is the reporter's own image on Muckrack had him standing in front of terraced farming in Peru, which is exactly what they do on really hilly terrain. So there was a lot of contradictions in the questions that were easy to just say, hey, look, you're asking the wrong questions. But again, looking at what the project did and how it was, what they got wrong in the coverage, first was the genesis of it. They were trying to say that this was already a national park, and that if you build a project on a national park, you're double dipping because the land's not endangered, and that ignored the whole genesis of the project, which was spelled out in the papers. And this was, the people doing this project was the Field Museum of Chicago, and people who are not out to just make a buck. They were really trying to save this thing. It was very clear. They were able to, the VVBs did a really good job of going in and looking for paper trails, and they could see that this thing they were struggling to keep, first of all, that the NGOs had gotten the park designated. They were on the hook for paying for it. They had to go and they had to get this money to keep it going. And REDD was really a lifeline, and it covers 90% of their costs. This is one of those things that comes up over and over again on these projects is it's easy to get money, philanthropic money, to start something. It's hard to continue it. This happens all the time. Everybody wants to pay philanthropic efforts. They want to pay for bright, shiny objects and say, this is what we created. Nobody wants to keep somebody else's thing going. And bringing in this kind of finance enables that. The other was the baseline thing that I mentioned. They were trying to say that, it was, if you look at the jobs that they created in the park for the people who were there, they were all based on sustainable land management, and then they prevented new people from coming in, and in-migration into the area decreased. Another thing there was a claim by a group called the Forest Peoples Program. That's one of these ideologically driven NGOs out of Europe. When I mentioned the tribes of the climate realm, if you tell me these guys put out an analysis of a project, I'll tell you what they're going to say before I even read it, because they always say the same thing. And in this particular case, they claimed that indigenous people weren't consulted, which wasn't true. Then the reporter also came in with, he had a letter from MINAM, or an analysis from MINAM, which is the Environment Ministry, which was saying that deforestation in the buffer area around the project was really high. And he was trying to say that proved there was leakage coming from the project area. But it actually, if you read the paper, what it was showing was the threats were high. That's what MINAM was talking about. So there's just, I do plan on covering this in more detail, but the project itself had a very clear objective. They took it through, they protected the area, they documented it, and then it was attacked instead of evaluated. And I don't want to say in this, I keep mentioning this issue of in-migration. It should be evaluated. We're at this point. It's at the point where the project should be, all these projects should be reevaluated, and they are. All the baselines are reassessed and everything is redone before they go forward. That's part of the plan. But to come in and just say this thing doesn't work because of a few accusations that don't really take the structure of the project into account is just destructive. And there's another one I can point to. Again, there's a lot of them, but there's one that I wrote up a piece on in 2022. If you don't mind me giving you something that people can Google,
please.
They Google Nikkei Asia's half-truths and innuendo undermine climate progress. It's in Nikkei Asia's half-truths and innuendo undermine climate progress. You'll see an analysis that I did that just shows how a reporter got a lot wrong. And that's kind of what happens whenever a project is sort of targeted. It's like a denial of service attack on fact checking. They'll come at you with 20 or 30 things that they could have easily figured out by looking into a project design document. And instead, it's not real reporting. And at the same time, it's like this, it's this weird dynamic that we're in, because there are legitimate issues that need to be addressed. The whole point of this thing is that we're going to be taking a critical look at projects. We're going to be evaluating them. We're going to be identifying what works, what doesn't, why, how do we move forward? And that's got to happen. But this cherry picking and plucking things out of context, it's almost like if you go into the city of Chicago and you say, oh, look, there's crime in Chicago. It's a horrible city. We should remove its charter. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean that the crime doesn't exist. The crime does exist, but it doesn't mean everything is wrong. And you have to evaluate, again, everything in balance. And I think there was actually a LinkedIn post recently from Donna Lee, who was complaining about people throwing stones at people who make legitimate critiques. And I think that is a danger too. We have to acknowledge that this is the whole point of an evolutionary process is figuring out what works, what doesn't, and moving forward. But at the same time, we can't be using people who are trying to make a species extinct. Species has to evolve, not be made extinct.
Yeah, and it's so tricky and so important that we all find a way to get this right, because these are tricky issues that there's a lot of ambiguity. It's difficult to know certain things for sure. And well-meaning people are going to have very serious disagreements and very firmly held convictions. And each of us has to, I always like the expression, speak like you're right and listen like you're wrong. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who's been in this, I liked your way of putting it. We need evaluations, not attacks. For our listeners who are also reading in this space, are there any hallmarks that you would point to of, okay, when are you seeing a well-meaning evaluation that's critical versus when are you seeing in attack? Like, are there certain things you look for?
I think we haven't seen much yet in the public space. I think what we've seen is competing narratives that are being proactively pushed. Because what would be a good reflection would be something that I think is holistic, or that just talks about, let's take stock of a project, or of the whole system. Instead it's like, these narratives like, oh, the system's broken, needs to be uprooted and begun over. No, that's not the answer. If you're looking at stuff that says that is saying, okay, 10 years in, what have we learned? That's a nice balanced approach. And I haven't seen either of those. I've seen some good reporting. I think it's interesting too. If you look at some of the majors have tended to get it right, and they've tended to stay clear, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They've not really touched this much, except to do individual stories here and there about projects. I think because they know it's complicated, whereas a lot of others are kind of rushing in to just kind of repeat the narratives. But as to what would be, it would be something that reflects the accurate narrative, which is, what have we learned in the first decade of voluntary carbon? What were the mistakes, and what can be fixed, and how is it being fixed going forward? But there's this tendency these days to not want to try to explain something, but to want to be seen as an investigator. And a lot of stuff that's not really investigative is just being fed by activists, which is not a constructive approach.
So I guess we got to look out for stories that make it seem much simpler than it is, and people who are much more sure of themselves than any of us should be.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, I really appreciate you joining us today on Smarter Markets, Steve, and sharing your insights and perspectives, and the insights and perspectives you share on your Bionic Planet podcast. And I wanted to wrap up today. As I said, you're a journalist who's been engaged in climate and carbon for a long time. And I was hoping you could end our conversation today by sharing a few of your thoughts on the types of questions you think journalists and reporters should be asking in order to cover this space better. And what should the market participants be doing in order to both do better and to communicate better?
Yeah, I think if I can start with the second one, because I think the second one leads to the problems with the first one, which is we need to do a much better job of explaining, well, what I'm trying to do, the history of these markets and the science that underpins them. I think Vera does a good job of explaining how their methodologies work, but they don't really explain the science that underpins them and where it comes from. And it's that needs to be done. And I think that there's this quest to keep things simple, but keeping things simple doesn't mean simplistic. It doesn't mean leaving out details. It means presenting them in a way where there's a clear cause and effect sequence, where you can see where things come from, where they, how they all fit together. So I think they need to really explain not just what they do, but how they do it. And again, that's what I'm hoping to do. So then part of me hopes they don't do it before I get to it, because I want to kind of own that. But the other, and in terms of reporters, I think most reporters, by the way, are really trying to do this right. I've talked to enough. It was one of the interesting things to my brief time at Vera was most reporters they come in, they want to know how it works. You try to explain it to them, and they kind of go, okay, I get it now. And I think to step back and really ask yourself, who am I talking to? Who's telling me stuff? What's the big picture in these things? Looking at a project, it's just, I remember that when I first came into this, and it was just so confusing. It's not a one and done thing. Don't think you can drop in, do a piece that's accurate on this and be finished. You've really got to spend some time understanding the drivers of deforestation, understanding, because it is, as we say, a classic wicked problem, and understanding uncertainty, and being open-minded, being really putting your preconceptions aside and asking everybody what, like we're all supposed to do anyway, trying to figure out what are the real challenges, what are the real causes of deforestation on the ground, how are the projects addressing it, and what could have been done differently. I think there's a lot of times they'll zero in on something. These methodologies, they've really thought of, it's the best minds in the world, on the planet, dealing with this stuff. Hundreds of people have spent years and years trying to identify the most predictive drivers of deforestation. And you get reporters who pop up they will think, oh, this, here's something that, I disagree with and you must have missed it. And no, that's not usually the case. Usually it's, it may be a driver, something that was not found to be predictive over time, even if it seems logical. So really just putting your ego aside, questioning your premises, learning the context, doing your homework. Try to be at least as thorough as a sports reporter. You don't want to be like a guy who covers American football, and he goes to cover international football, soccer, and he says, hey, these guys are all idiots. They're not using their hands, and that's his headline. You want to be, or like a soccer reporter who says, oh, look at American football. These guys are all cheating. They're picking each other up. They're throwing each other on the ground. They're running with the ball in their hand. Learn the strengths, the limitations of all the tools that people are using to meet the climate challenge and how they all fit together. And then just don't confuse things that are problems with the nature of reality itself to problems that are specific to something like this.
Thanks again to Steve Zwick, host and producer of Bionic Planet. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Carbon Frontiers 2024. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is presented by Base Carbon, a financier of projects involved primarily in the global voluntary carbon markets. Base Carbon endeavors to be the preferred carbon project partner in providing capital and management resources to carbon removal and abatement projects globally, and where appropriate, will utilize technologies within the evolving environmental industries to enhance efficiencies, commercial credibility, and trading transparency. For more information, visit basecarbon.com. Base Carbon, sensible carbon investing. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.